Okay, so as I was saying right now, we'll be covering chapter 2 here today, which discusses, um, it talks about the constitutional setting. So we will be referencing a lot to the U.S. Constitution and how the Texas Constitution relates to the U.S. Constitution. We'll be doing some comparing and contrasting of, what is within the Texas Constitution. How is it similar to the U.S. Constitution? How is it different? We'll take a look at some of the historical aspects as to why Texas has the state constitution that it has today. So that's what we're going to be doing here within our chapter 2 discussion. So let me go ahead and share the screen here. Hold on. Okay, there we go. So let me go ahead and expand it here. Okay. Okay, all right, sounds good. Okay, so you all should be able to see chapter 2, right? The constitutional setting. So let's go ahead and dive into the chapter objectives here in terms of what I was talking about a little while ago, but let's go through all of these here. So with the chapter 2 objectives, by the end of this chapter, you should be able to understand the nature of federal systems of government. And we touched a little bit on this last time when we were referencing some of the different types of federalism. So we're going to go more into detail here within this chapter about what federalism is and the different forms of federalism that we've seen throughout American history, where some of those historical events that precipitated the need and the evolution, or the need to change the federalist system, the evolution of our federalist system, and what it is, what it looks like today. Understand the purposes of constitutions as well in terms of why do we have them, what are they for, as well as the extent to which these are reflected in the Texas Constitution. Excuse me. Explain how the rights written in the constitutions and other rights assumed but not written sometimes conflict with one another, and how those conflicts have recently emerged in Texas politics. And we have touched on this a little bit in chapter 1. We've talked about some of those conflicts, those constitutional conflicts, and those constitutional disagreements between Texas and the federal government, which, as I've mentioned before, happens more often than you might think, especially when you have, as I mentioned also before, especially when you have the heads of these levels of government being of different political parties, right? We referenced before about how President Biden, being a Democrat, being the head of the executive branch of the federal government, will have to have a very nuanced working relationship with Governor Greg Abbott, at the head of the executive branch in Texas, since he's a Republican, right? So those different political parties do definitely play a big time role. Those different political philosophies, those different political ideals do play a big role in terms of fostering this type of conflict and trying to resolve this conflict, which sometimes is not easy to do. Well, a lot of times it's not easy to do, but even more so in today's polarized political climate in today's day and age. Describe the history of Texas constitutions. We're gonna take a look at the numerous constitutions that Texas has had over the years. Even going back to when they were part of Mexico, with the constitution, when Texas was conjoined with the state of Mexican state of Coahuila. So we'll take a look at that. Discuss the key aspects of the present Texas Constitution. So we will do a quick analysis of the Texas Constitution. Unlike in federal government, where we actually read through the actual articles and sections of the U.S. Constitution, it would take us weeks to be able to go through the entire Texas Constitution because of just how lengthy it is. And we'll talk about, why is it lengthy? What are the benefits of it being lengthy? What are the, what are the detriments to it, the pros and cons, so to speak? So we'll take a look at that here. And then analyze the need for and the politics behind constitutional change. So we're going to take a look at some of the modern day criticisms of the Texas Constitution, particularly how lengthy it is and how there's a lot of specialized aspects within the state constitution. There's a good video in the additional resources that's produced by the Texas League of Women Voters, and it's about a 5-minute video, so I definitely recommend for you all to watch it. Outside of our class meetings, so that you all can see that there are some legit criticisms about the way the Constitution is set up, the fact that it's lengthy, whereas, and again, and it's not necessarily a right or wrong thing, it's just a different way of going about things. So it depends on you in terms of how you internalize that and how you view this, right? Would you prefer a short Constitution, kind of like our U.S. Constitution, which is very broad, open for interpretation, a lot of people call it a living, breathing document because it kind of adapts with the time, so to speak, and it allows for Supreme Court decisions to interpret the Constitution and then put forth these court opinions that then become binding case law, right? I mean, because if you look at things like, originally Roe versus Wade, of course now the Hobbs case that is overturned Roe versus Wade, we see that there's nothing in the Constitution specifically talking about the abortion issue, right? But the Supreme Court has been able to use the Constitution to interpret how this issue does relate to the Constitution. So even though it's not in the Constitution itself, we have enough latitude and flexibility to be able to, for the courts to make these rulings based on their interpretation of the Constitution. Whereas in Texas, everything is spelled out. Well, most everything, right? It's very spelled out. It's very wordy. It's very lengthy. Think of it as like, one of these like policy manuals that you get from like work, how like it could be like 100 pages long, right? You've got policy manuals at work that are longer than our own US Constitution. And those policy manuals, right, especially if you work in the public sector, those policy manuals definitely have to be constitutional. So it's interesting, right? Think about that, right? That you have the highest of these documents, that all these other documents, all these, like let's say, policy manual for the college I work at, right? That of course has to be constitutional. But it's interesting that the policy manual is even longer than the actual US Constitution itself, right? But Texas is not like that. Texas is like that policy manual where it's very long, very wordy, lots of different provisions in there. And so we'll talk about, how some people might feel that might not necessarily be the best way to govern, right? So, excuse me, we'll take a look at some of those issues here. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with a quick discussion on American federalism. As we talked a little bit about this last time, and of course, as I mentioned here, okay, give me just a moment, hold on. I've been yawning all day, sorry about that. As we mentioned as I mentioned before, that within Texas government, we do a lot of reviewing from federal government. So even though, as I've said before, I do prefer for y'all to take federal government first, that doesn't mean that we can't still do like a quick recap. Kind of like when you're watching part 2 of a movie, and some of these movies, they have like a quick recap before of what happened, kind of like, like on an episode recap, right? But some movies do that as well, like, like Back to the Future does that, the Rocky movies, they do that. So that's kind of like what we're doing. We're kind of doing like a quick recap of 2305 here within 2306, the sequel, I guess you could say. Anyway, so with that being said, when we look at American federalism, we have to, of course, look at the division of power, because that in a nutshell is what federalism is about. It's dividing that power, sharing that power. There's different words for it, balancing that power, balancing that shared power amongst the different levels of government, right? So that's in a nutshell what federalism is, right? Like we talked about before last time, right? That you don't have the federal government just controlling everything. It's not just one level of government that controls all the functions of the government. You have different levels of government that have their own unique responsibilities, right? So you've got the federal government, which deals with federal issues such as immigration, currency, interstate commerce, trading between, commerce and trading between the states, as well as foreign policy and international issues, foreign relations with other countries. Then, of course, as you get, as you move down the totem pole, so to speak, as you get, because the federal government, of course, is looked at as the highest level, right? Because the supremacy clause, like we talked about before, and because of that, they tend to handle real macro size issues, right? Issues that affect Americans as a whole, right? Everyone in the country is affected by foreign policy, right? Because we're all Americans, we're all members of the United States, and so the president, acting as the top diplomat, he's got this trip lined up to go to India. And the president, of course, will do a lot of those things where the president will go and conduct those meetings, being, and meeting with foreign leaders. That affects all of us, right? Because we are all Americans, we all live in this country. But as you move further down the totem pole of the levels of government, as we get down to state and local governments, you'll notice that the responsibilities of these governments become a little bit more narrow, right? They only pertain to a certain smaller group of people, right? Not necessarily America as a whole, but more so people within a state, people within a county, people within a city, even all the way down to school boards, right? People that live within a school district, right? So as you can see, the lower, the lower that we go on the totem pole of government, the more specialized and zeroed in those responsibilities are, right? So I want you all to things that that deal mostly with everyday life, not necessarily dealing with things, with international affairs, but more of the everyday life events and responsibilities that we are responsible for and think of when we think of government, right? So that's why state governments tend to they tend to be involved with when it comes to morality, right? With the passing of state criminal laws, right, and things like that. Um, and then moving on down to local governments, they deal more with city ordinances and public work services like your garbage and your garbage collection and your water and things like that. And of course, even more specialized with school districts, they deal specifically with education, right? They don't really, that's what their goal is, right? They're not going to be dealing with like manufacturing or agriculture, right? Unless of course the students are studying that as part of their classes, but they're not going to. The school district itself is not going to be involved in those things because their scope is very narrow. Now, the reason why I say all this is because I want you all to understand the purpose of federalism and why we tend to have it here. Now let's look at types of federalism here. Now, like I said, historically we have shifted from these beginning with dual federalism all the way through cooperative and picket fence federalism. Let's take a look at these first. So dual federalism, of course, is considered the layer cake model. If you took Government 2305, you'll be familiar with Gordon's his analogy, right? That with dual federalism, it's considered layer cake because the layers of the cake are separate from each other, right? They're several separate layers, whether two or three, they are separate layers that are baked, separately, right? And then they're put on top of each other, right? So in dual federalism, state and national governments operate independently from one another, right? So this is where you have that strict divide. National governments doing their thing, states are doing their thing, and this is what we had, from the inception of our country all the way up until the New Deal, so to speak, right? I always like to use analogies. I use this in federal government. So if you took me in federal government, I apologize that I'm using this analogy again. But dual federalism is basically like where you've got a neighbor and you don't interact with your neighbor at all, right? You've got your fence, you divide it, you're divided amongst the fence and between the fence, and so you're living your life, they're living their lives, and there's no interaction. That's how dual federalism is. Cooperative federalism, of course, is the marble cake analogy, where the different flavors are baked into the entire cake, and you can't really separate, like the confetti style cakes. I'm sure some of y'all have seen those before, right? Where the different flavors are baked in, and you can't really separate it unless you go into the cake and take it out, right? But a slice of cake is going to have all these different confetti flavors. So in cooperative federalism, this is an emphasis on cooperation and collective interaction between states and the nation. And so this is the form of federalism that we saw in the aftermath of the Great Depression, and then FDR's New Deal policies that were put into place to combat against the insanely high unemployment rates and things like that. So instead of, and again, and the issue of federalism was a big time issue during, leading up to the 1932 presidential election, because Republican Herbert Hoover was trying to make the argument that the federal government couldn't do anything, right? That this had to be a state, local government, private charity issue, right? The federal government was not able to go and get involved, so to speak, right? So FDR, had the presence of mind and the wherewithal to say, you know what? No, this is an emergency. Times are tough. We've never faced this type of emergency in American history. So it's all hands on deck. We got to do something about this. And so that was the mindset that won out in the 1932 election. Also, not surprising that FDR has been our longest serving president. Was serving up to 4 terms. And of course, because of him, we put in the provision in the Constitution to limit presidents to only 2 terms. But with that being said, this idea is where, when it comes to cooperative federalism, hold on a second. When it comes to cooperative federalism, what it's discussing here is that instead of the state and the national governments just being totally separate and doing their own things, you've got the states and the national government working together to achieve these mutual goals and address these mutual concerns, right? Again, another analogy I like to use is for cooperative federalism. This is where you have your neighbor. You still have the fence between you and your neighbor, but you all do stuff together, right? Like, let's say you all watch, like, the football games that just started this past weekend, right? You all have the barbecues, right? You all are hanging out, right? You all are friends. That would be an example of cooperative federalism. And so this is the model of federalism that pretty much won out since the Great Depression and the New Deal. And I talk about in federal government how that the main reason, the main way that the federal government is able to work together with the states and for the states to, for the most part, basically buy into what the federal government is wanting for the states to do is the fact the federal government has a lot more resources than the states. Because the federal government is responsible for the money, and and of course, I don't really want to get into like a whole economics debate about the Fed and their ability to print money and all that. That's a whole other story. That's that'd be more so for your economics class. But the idea is that, with that being said, the idea is that the federal government definitely has a lot more money, a lot more resources than the states, because the states can't print out their own money. So the states they don't have as much flexibility to be able to fund programs, and so this is why a lot of states, like I know Texas is a great example of this. Texas has a lot of federal money that is used to supplement the state budgets, right? Whether it's education, with federal money going in education, whether it's the building of the interstates. That's why it's important for highways to get that interstate designation, not necessarily just because you've got that nice fancy blue sign there, although that sign is nice, but it's more so because now you have access to federal funds in order to upkeep the the interstates, right? So a few years ago, we finally got like Expressway 83 finally got its distinction as I-2, right? I'm sure you have seen that, right? So we are officially an interstate now, to where now we get that federal money. So federal money is usually the way that the states are able to, even if the states might not necessarily agree totally with what the federal government is wanting them to do, the states will usually end up, coalescing because of the money. Although we will take a look at an example right now where the states did not coalesce, like Texas was one of these. And then more recently, we have what's called picket fence federalism. This is more of a new term where it's a variant of cooperative federalism. All levels of government are involved in policy making and implementation, local levels, bureaucracies, and interest groups. So picket fence federalism is similar to cooperative federalism. It's just that it's not just the states and the federal government who are coordinating and collaborating and making these decisions. It's also other groups, right? It's also, because it's not just like politicians, it's also the bureaucracies. What a bureaucracy is these are the people that work within government, right? These are the people that are not necessarily making the top level decisions like we see like in Congress when it comes to the passing of laws and the funding of these agencies, but they're the ones who administer and manage the agencies, right? They're the ones who are actually, these are more of the people that you interact with government, as opposed to like elected officials, right? This would be, the everyday people that work in government. So I would be considered a bureaucrat too, right? Because I'm a professor in a college, right? And so I have to adhere to college policies, state policies, federal policies. I can't really deviate from that because I am part of the bureaucracy. I am tasked with certain responsibilities, and I have to adhere to those responsibilities, right? So again, so these bureaucracies, these agencies that are tasked with following through on what Congress passes or what the state legislature passes, school districts, of course, other examples as well. And then of course the interest groups. These are the outside groups that we talked about before. These are groups that have a vested interest in a certain cause and want to get involved within government policymaking because it's their right to do so under the First Amendment, and which we'll talk more about interest groups later on. Now, also keep in mind that picket fence federalism could also involve the private sector as well. We see, and especially in this country, everyone, we do see a lot of private sector involvement when it comes to governmental decisions. Like a great example was recently, of course, with the vaccine rollout. That was a partnership with these pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer, Moderna. They were partnering up with the federal government, to where the federal government was providing them with money to research, getting these vaccines ready to go as quickly as possible, right? So it's not just the federal government handling everything, right? They also partner up with the private sector. Another example is during emergencies. So you've probably seen this before, right? Where let's say you've got a major hurricane that affects people along the Gulf Coast. Texas has had their share, but Louisiana has had it really bad the last couple of years. They've had some very, very strong storms, like Laura pretty much caused so much damage in Lake Charles, and then we've had other ones as well in the last couple of years. There was another, I forget the one that hit New Orleans a couple of years ago, but Louisiana's had some pretty tough hurricanes the last couple of years, and so HEB, of course, as we all know, the top grossing, the top grocery company in Texas was able to go to Louisiana and provide food and meals for people who were affected by the hurricanes, right? So that's another example of picket fence federalism where the federal government, the state governments, the local governments, as well as private companies will I'm sorry, will as I was trying to see two words over there, they will collaborate with together, right? They'll coordinate, they'll collaborate with each other, and they will try to provide assistance, for these issues, especially in times of emergency, right? So it's all hands on deck when we talk about emergency. So I hope these different examples of federalism make sense to you. Okay. Now, oh, that's right. I needed to also talk about the 10th Amendment. I totally skipped that one. Sorry about that. Hold on. Let's see. Now let's see. Okay, hold on. Let me go back here. Okay, so let's talk about the 10th Amendment as well, really quick, because I do need to discuss that in terms of why the states have the powers that they have. Because the 10th Amendment also is known as the Reserve Clause Amendment. The 10th Amendment discusses this idea that whatever is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution as powers belonging to the federal government automatically default to the states. Now, this is a very powerful amendment right here, because basically what it's saying is that in the future, any new responsibility of government that comes up where we as a society determine that government needs to get involved in this and get involved heavily, it's going to fall on the states to be the ones to take the lead on that responsibility. An example is education. So education, and what I mean by this is that looking at education in America historically. Now, if you recall during the time of the founders and the framers that, a lot of these framers were educated, but there was a reason why only a certain few people were educated, right? Because there was no public education back then. Education was a luxury. So a lot of these framers who were very wealthy were educated because of the wealth that they had, right? But the average American back then was not educated. It wasn't until more recent times where we as an American society decided that it was important to invest in public education, right? This is where we decided to start funding public education. Of course, there's been discussions about, do we fund it enough? That's, of course, a whole other story. But the idea is that now we've made that decision that we are going to fund education. With that being said, because education is not mentioned in the Constitution, because like I mentioned, it was simply a private affair, but now we've changed it and we've made it a public affair, it's going to fall on the states to adequately enforce the education policy and to ensure that public education is followed through with these standards, right? This is why if you look at school districts, they are considered, they're kind of like a hybrid of state and local employees, so to speak, but they do qualify for retirement purposes, right? And this is also why school districts school districts are administered by the Texas Education Agency, right? So again, the state is the one who is supposed to regulate and monitor school districts. We also have the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, which monitors colleges and universities, right? So it's not the federal government. The teachers are not federal employees. It's the states, right? The states are the ones who are responsible for education because, as I mentioned, that's a responsibility and power that was passed off to the states, because of this idea of reserve clauses, right? That it's those new responsibilities are reserved to the states. So let's say 500 years from now, let's say government gets involved in something new, some new responsibility. It's going to be the states, they're going to be take the lead on that, at least within our U.S. Constitution. So that's a very, very powerful amendment there that the states are privy to. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue here with American federalism. Let me just take a drink of water really quickly. Hold on. Okay, so this next section talks about federalism at work, and this is a good section here because this definitely does involve Texas. And let me explain here what's going on in terms of what this has to do with our study here of American federalism with respect to Texas. Okay, so if you're all familiar with Obamacare, right? Technically, the more appropriate term is the Affordable Care Act, but everybody knows it as Obamacare because it was Obama's major legislative accomplishment, even though, keep in mind, he was no longer in the Senate, right? He used to be the senator from Illinois, but then, of course, he ran for president, was able to win, so he had to vacate his Senate seat. But there's a reason why people still call it Obamacare, right? Because it was obviously, of course, his idea also, but of course he also called it Romney Care because he said that he got the model from former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney, which I just saw in the news today that he's not seeking re-election. He was the senator from Utah, but so I'll have to read as to why he's not, but that just came out today. But with that being said, so that's why I'm referencing Romney here, because Obama got his Obamacare idea from Romney, because Massachusetts had done something similar. But the idea behind this is that this was what President Obama at the time wanted for Congress to work on. So he can't make Congress do this, right? He cannot make members of Congress do this. He can't introduce legislation because he was no longer in the Senate. But because he was the president, he used his presidential influence, right? Being the de facto leader of the Democrats, and the Democrats had the majorities at the time, both in the House and the Senate. He was able to get, he was able to get for the Democrats to be on board, right? To be on the same page, right? So I just want to give a little bit of an example as to why it's considered Obamacare, even though technically he did not introduce it, but he does get the credit for it because he was behind this. Now, of course, we could go into Obamacare for a long time because it's a very long and complicated legislation. But the thing that I want you all to understand about what this has to do with federalism is that there was one provision in Obamacare that dealt with Medicaid expansion. Now, as you all are probably aware of, Medicaid, of course, is the federally funded and federally funded healthcare program, for poor people, right? People who live below the poverty line, right? We tend to see a lot of Medicaid recipients here in the Valley because of the extreme poverty, which we'll reference that in terms of what happened with Medicaid. So one of the provisions within Obamacare was that Medicaid was going to be expanded, and the way it was going to be expanded was it was going to be expanded for particularly those people, and I've been in this situation before, those people who made a little bit too much to qualify for Medicaid. They made just slightly more than the federal poverty rate, which I think is like 23,000. The reason why I say that I've been in this situation before, although not really, is that the first job I got out of college, I was making about 26,000. Now, thankfully, I had health insurance, but let's say I didn't have health insurance, I would have been in that group where I make a little bit too much to qualify for Medicaid, but I don't make enough to adequately pay for a private health care. So Obama wanted to kind of bridge that gap a little bit to expand Medicaid for that group of people making in the mid to late 20s here. And so the idea was that this was going to be a mandated provision of, Obamacare. You probably heard of that word mandate before. They've been talking about it for years because of COVID and all that. So, but anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that it was something that was going to be, the states had to go about it, right? They had to, the Medicaid was going to be expanded and the states weren't going to be able to dissent with it. Now, there was a Supreme Court ruling. There was the Sebelius case, named after Catherine Sebelius, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services at the time, which makes sense that it would be named after her because she is the top health administrator for a law that deals with health, right? So that's why the case involved her. That's why she was involved in it. Catherine, look her up. Her name is Catherine Sebelius. So the Sebelius case basically involved some of these private businesses that said that they felt that was unconstitutional, right? That Medicaid could not be expanded. And so then the courts basically came to, I guess you could say, somewhat of a compromise here, where the court said, okay, we're not going to make it mandatory that the states have to take this Medicaid because that is an example of a tax. And so the states do have, these states who are making this argument, they do have that right to object to this because this is going to cost the states more money. So instead, what the Supreme Court did is that the Supreme Court said that the states have to opt in to the Medicaid expansion. They have to accept it. And so what this meant is that the federal government had to persuade the states to accept the Medicaid expansion. Now, a lot of these states already have. Of course, obviously, the Democrat states, the blue states, but even a lot of red states have also accepted the Medicaid expansion. Texas is one of the few holdouts that still has not accepted it. Now, there's a good video that I definitely also want you all to watch that discusses this. It's in the additional resources where it basically talks about how that for the first couple of years, the federal government was going to fund, was basically, so if Texas had accepted the Medicaid expansion, that the federal government was going to pay for it 100%, right? Texas would not have to pay for any of it. Then eventually, in a couple of years later, Texas would have to, the federal government would pay 90% and Texas would have to foot 10%. Now, again, I'm not trying to say one way or another in terms of, whether Texas should have taken it or not. I mean, I've got my own opinions about it. But in terms of looking at both arguments to this issue, I want to explain that the state of Texas was making the argument that that was going to cost a lot of money, right? Because even though it's 10%, that's still 10% of about 1 million people. From what I last read, that it did about 1 million people in Texas would have qualified for this Medicaid expansion, right? So Texas felt that putting 10% of 1 million people was too much. Now, also keep in mind, though, that it's not just simply a cost analysis, although that was the argument that the Texas officials were making. But it's also because this goes against the political viewpoints of the majority party in Texas, which is the Republicans, right? Republicans tend to not be in favor of these federal programs, right? These entitlement programs. You probably heard the phrase entitlement programs. That's what they like to call it. And so they feel, and especially because of this idea of Medicaid, right? This idea that, these are people that, could get health insurance if they were working. So if we give them Medicaid, that might, give them an incentive to not work. Similar thing with the SNAP program, that if, if these people are getting the welfare, the SNAP, then that might de-incentivize them to go to work and things like that, which I've got some opinions about that because I used to be on SNAP. And now I'm pretty successful, but we'll just leave it at that. But anyway, but with that being said, but again, the point I'm trying to make here is that Texas was making a financial decision, but also a decision that was heavily influenced by their own political viewpoints, right? That that this goes against the political ideas of the people that were elected, right? So those are some of the examples as to why Texas has refused to participate. One last thing I'll mention is that a good portion of those people that would have qualified do tend to live down here, like in the South Texas area, as well as some of these inner cities and all that. And also like in the rural areas, right? These people, whether it's like some of these people that might like minorities, but also some some of the rural people out in rural Texas. So the point is that this would have benefited people in our community and also across the state. So just something to think about, right, in terms of how you all view this issue here. So, but again, I wanted to give you an example of how federalism at work here. Okay, now let's go to purposes of the Constitution. Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, right. So again, let me also mention that these are also some other examples, right, of federalism, right? So examples of federal influence, like I was talking about, federal dollars that support the state budget, as I was mentioning earlier, civil rights and liberties, to enforce the the Civil Rights Act, and this is why you might see some cases where some people, like you've probably seen some of these cases where in these like use of force cases, right, where if the state is not going to bring up charges against officers for use of force, unauthorized use of force, let's make that clear. The federal government could also get in through the Justice Department, through their Civil Rights Division, and try to file charges that officers had violated, someone's civil rights, especially if you see this like with minorities, right? So that's one example there. Accessibility of public buildings by the disabled. So I always like to mention, that a personal story of mine was, because I remember vividly when this was happening was this was at the turn of the 90s when I was in elementary school. And I noticed, I don't remember what year it was exactly. It was in the early 90s, like, but the point is that, well, I do know the year that it started, but what I'm trying to say is that I don't recall the year of when I was actually noting this, but let me get to the point. So I was noticing when I was in early elementary, I think it was like in first or second grade, that there were wheelchair ramps being put up everywhere. Like everybody was building them at the same time. And I was like, what's going on here? Why are all of these wheelchair ramps going up? Well, later on, when I grew up and I started studying this stuff, I was able to put two and two together. And I was like, oh, the early 90s was when the ADA was passed, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. So it was clear that, that what was going on was that these buildings had to build these wheelchair ramps for, disabled people to be able to access these buildings, these public buildings, because of the new law that had just passed, right? That's why the wheelchair ramps were going up everywhere. So again, I didn't know what the ADA was when I was little, but looking back on it now I see that. So I just want to share that story of how I saw these wheelchair ramps going up all at the same time. Ways in which poverty is remediated, right? Like we talked about, can the federal government provide expansion of these federal dollars to these programs? And we will talk later on about how the states and the federal government are in this partnership when it comes to these federal programs. Because you might say to yourself, hey, wait a minute, isn't food stamps, isn't that a federal program? Isn't Medicaid, isn't that a federal program? Yes, it is. But in another example of federalism, to try, and the example of this is devolution. That's the term for this section of federalism, is that in more recent years, and this was brought about by the conservative administrations of, we saw mostly with Reagan, but Nixon also in the 1970s. So during the 70s and 80s, for the most part, and into the early 90s, it was mostly conservative. We mostly had conservative ideology. As a result of what was happening in the 60s, we kind of saw like a social pushback to, like the hippie generation and all that stuff. So we did have Jimmy Carter that one year, but and he was also regarded more so as a centrist anyway. So kind of similar like to Bill Clinton, who was also considered a centrist. So again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to make all these political references. But with that being said, these programs, even though they're federal programs, the states also are the ones who administer them. And I'll talk more about this because I do have some experience, not working with these programs, but I have applied for them, so I can explain to you all how the process is. When right before I became a teacher, I was working I had to move to Laredo to go study at TAMU over there to get my master's to be able to teach here. And I was in between jobs. I didn't have any money. Thankfully, I was able to get a job in elementary as soon as I got to Laredo, so I was very happy about that. Very fortunate because I did need to work. But before then, they had in order to qualify for the SNAP program, even though it's a federal program, I had to submit documentation to the Texas Health and Human Services Commission, right? So they are the ones who determine the eligibility, because they administer the federal programs. Because again, the federal government is devolving that power to the states. That yes, it's the federal government's money, but we're going to let the states decide how it's spent, who's eligible, and things like that. We'll talk a little bit later on in terms of why the states wanted that. And then of course, protection of the environment. We saw with the creation of the EPA under the Nixon administration, and we've seen, how the Environmental Protection Agency has tried to, pass forth, strong regulations to try to limit the number of carbon emissions that companies can produce. I know a couple of days ago, I saw there was a story that ERCOT was able to seek federal approval to generate more electricity, even though that would increase the carbon output or things like that, because of how hot it's been here. Of course, we can talk about ERCOT all day. There's a lot of people have opinions about them. Effects on Texans of the deployment of federal troops to areas of conflict, right? Of course, so we'll talk about the National Guard a little bit later on and how, the governor does have that authority and things like that. The economic impact of congressional legislation and presidential bureaucratic decisions, including Federal Reserve policies to expand or contract the economy. So again, we mentioned a little bit about the Federal Reserve, like with the interest rates, them changing the prime rate, which I'm sure some of y'all, if you have credit cards, you're familiar with that. But again, these are all examples of federal influence within the state, right? So, because some of y'all might be asking, okay, so when it comes to federalism, nowadays there's plenty of federal influence, right? It didn't used to be this way, right? We used to have the states and this is a funny cartoon, right? Dear ultra-level intrusive, freedom snatching, job killing, deficit ballooning, climate hoaxing, gun confiscating, not even born in this country. So, Mr. President, please send us more. So that's pretty funny. I love political cartoons because they kind of poke fun at politics and how because what it's talking about here, it's talking about the kind of like the hypocrisy, right? Where the conservative state legislature might be trashing Obama, like personally, like in the news or all that, but then they'll be quick to ask the federal government for money. So it's kind of an interesting take on their, in terms of the way politics is here. Okay, anyway, let's go ahead and continue. Okay, so purposes of Constitution. So I think we have about 15 minutes left. So we'll try to finish up as much as we can. Like I said, I can talk about this all day. This for me, this is really interesting. So legitimacy. Let's get into some political theory here. Now, the definition of legitimacy is when the people govern accept its government's acts as moral, fair, and just, and thus believe they should obey its laws. So this whole idea of legitimacy is extremely important because, and it's something that we're still dealing with as American people, right? I mean, we saw this play out recently with the COVID pandemic. We saw, people, having issues with legitimacy, right, in terms of the the decisions to do like the lockdowns, the mask mandates, and the vaccines and all that stuff. There's a lot of issues when it comes to legitimacy there, for better or for worse, right? For better or for worse, there was a decent sized segment of the American public, and that's their right to believe what they believe in, because of the freedom we have here in this country. They had the right to express themselves and basically make their points heard. Now, of course, we also have to make sure that we fact check all that, and we have to, as a responsible and as an informed citizen, we definitely have to, try our best to, look at the facts and then make our own decisions. But for some of these people, they're still going to go and make those arguments and things like that. So it is what it is. That's what we have in a democracy, right? We have different opinions, right? We have different viewpoints and different ways of going about saying these things as well. That's another thing I want for people to understand also, is that the way people say things doesn't really get talked about too much. I know for me, like that's like when I've had discussions with people that disagree with me, my they call it a bone of contention. I don't know if you've heard of that phraseology before, but my contention that I had with some of these people, not necessarily that they disagreed with me or I disagreed with them, but the way they said it, the way they came at it, is where I had to, kind of put my foot down and be like, no, we're not gonna do it that way. So if you want to talk with me, you want to date with me, you're gonna do it respectfully, so I don't want to get too much into that. I'm just saying that, you all have probably had some of those discussions before. Some of these discussions get really heated. But let's go ahead and continue, right? So this idea of legitimacy basically discusses that, does the public buy into what the government is doing? Why should people obey its laws, right? What is the incentive for people to obey these laws? What happens if people don't believe that these laws are moral, just, and fair? If you have that, then you're going to have consequences of illegitimacy, right? Because when we look at legitimacy, we also have to go back to John Locke and some of these other philosophers, that talked about the social contract theory. The social contract theory, which I definitely am a big part of that, is that we are willing to give up some of these rights, some of this, some of these, in some cases, privacy, for the betterment of society and for the benefit of the greater good, right? That's the whole idea of social contract, right? We kind of saw this with the pandemic, right? Where people were willing to, in the interest of safety, because it was a public health emergency, some people were willing to go and mask up and, social distance, limit those things, So, but again, you also had some people who didn't agree with that, right? So again, those are examples of issues with the legitimacy, right? If people feel the government's going too far, or they don't, they don't feel, they don't agree with the decisions that the government is making, right? Then that is where you have, consequences of this illegitimacy, where people are not going to really go along with what the government is saying. So the government always does have to keep that in mind in terms of, and look, I can go on and on about, how, my thoughts about the government during the pandemic, and things like that. But anyway, it is what it is. But just keep that in mind in terms of that there are serious consequences if people don't feel that the government is legit. Of course, we've seen that play out in the last couple of years, and for other things too, for other reasons as well. Not just COVID, but I use COVID as an example because it's something that we've all seen and we've all experienced in some way, shape, or form. And then the influence of political culture. So the political culture of a region is also very important in determining how the people within that culture are going to view legitimacy. And so Texas's constitution is very restrictive, as we mentioned before. And Texas's constitution is restrictive because of the nature of Texas's political culture. We touched on this a little bit last time, right? We touched on how some of the main reasons why Texas tends to be have a conservative political culture compared to other states is because of that rich history. The fact that we fought a Revolutionary War at the state level, very similar to what the colonists did to Great Britain in the American Revolutionary War. Basically, very similar reasons, right? Pushing back against a strong centralized government and not allowing for local control of local officials, right? Very similar aspects. So we did that. The people who populated Texas, Texas was very sparsely populated, but then you had a lot of Southerners coming in. So they brought their Southern values and their Southern traditions and their conservative nature. The American South has always been conservative, even though the Democrats and Republicans have changed, they've realigned, but the region has always been conservative. So because, Texas was in such proximity to the American South, they were able to bring those ideas, and that political culture to Texas, right? So So all of it, all of these historical reasons, definitely, so it's not surprising why Texas is rather conservative. Of course, you can also make the argument about religion too, that Texas has a lot of evangelicalism, but they also have a lot of Catholicism too, and Catholicism tends to be conservative, especially when it comes to the abortion issue, right? That's why you tend to have a lot of Catholics who tend to be pro-life. Now, again, the issue there, though, is that are they going to extend that pro-life idea? Are they just going to keep it to themselves? Or are they going to mobilize and pursue it as a national and state policy, right? So, so again, but that's a whole other story. But the idea that I want for us to talk about here is these are the reasons, the political culture definitely has a lot to do with determining whether a government is legitimate or not, because these are the people, right? We, the people, right? We are the ones who ultimately hand over power through the social contract to these elected officials. And so these elected officials need to do what we tell them to do, because we're the public, we elect them, we pay their salaries, because of our taxes. So they definitely need to be receptive to the public, right? And things like that. Okay, so purpose of constitution. So organizing government. Now, we talked about okay, let's go with separation of powers first, and then we'll go back to logistics here. So, of course, understand the separation of powers is the separation of the duties and responsibilities within government, right? This is why we have three branches of government, because we have a legislative branch that is responsible for passing laws, working on legislation and getting things passed, for us to follow as people. The executive branch is empowered to enforce those laws that are passed by the legislative branch to ensure that they're complied with. And then the judiciary branch is responsible for overseeing the laws and policies that are made by both the legislative and executive branch and ensuring that they are constitutional, right? And Texas is pretty much operates under the same setup, right? We have the same three branches of government in Texas. Of course, the major difference is they handle state law, and to an extent local as well. But we'll get more into that when we get to local government. But the idea is that we have these three branches of government. They operate pretty much the same way. The Texas legislature is, I would probably say, is the closest to the to its federal counterpart, because we have the same two chambers. They basically do the same thing. They're comprised of committees where they work on legislation, and they have the same type of Robert's Rule of Order procedure and things like that. And so I would say that the Texas legislature probably has the most similarity when it comes to their federal counterpart, the Congress. Then in the executive branch, of course, we have the role that they have is pretty much the same, enforcing the state laws, but the way they go about it is different, because you don't have one governor who is in complete control of the entire executive like you have at the federal government with the presidency. We'll talk about the plural executive a little bit later on, right? How the governor does not appoint all of the members of the state executive. In fact, most of them are not appointed. There's just a couple that are, such as the Secretary of State. However, most of them, like the lieutenant governor, the comptroller, the attorney general, they are independent electively of the governor. The governor has no direct involvement. Sure, they could try to campaign together, which they normally do, because they're of the same party. But the governor cannot technically tell Dan Patrick or Ken Paxton what to do. Things like that. And then logistics of governability is also important, because we have to understand that as our government has gotten bigger, and I've learned this, through some of my public administration classes that I've taken, because I've taken political science classes and public administration classes. They are different, but because public administration is more so, it defines itself, right? It's how government administers these laws that are passed, right? The day-to-day operations, and things like that. Funding, and that's why there's a lot of classes in public administration about funding and budgets and grants and how to manage people, right? Because this is more so for the bureaucrats. The bureaucrats definitely have a more public administration, background, and more of a public administration way of doing things, as opposed to elected officials who handle things more on the political science side of things. That's not to say that politicians can't be great administrators, because they're supposed to be, because they are at the very top of our government. So I definitely expect for our senators and Congress people to be fantastic administrators, because they're higher up than your city administrators, and things like that, your school district administrators. So your members of Congress handle a lot more responsibility than like a superintendent. So I would certainly expect for our senators to be even better managers than superintendents, because they're more responsible. It's not always the case, but that's certainly an expectation. At least that's an expectation I have. The higher up you go in government, the more is expected of you. At least that's the way I see things. So when I see some of these members of Congress, the way they act, it's like, well, I certainly can't do that at my work, so I don't know why they do, but it is what it is. But with that being said, let's go ahead. I sometimes say things a little too much. But anyway, with that being said, let's go ahead and continue here. So this idea of logistics of governability is important because government is responsible for so many things, coordinating with so many things. You have to be good at being able to organize all this, to be a good administrator of a lot of these programs, especially like I was saying, the higher up you go, the more you're going to be responsible for, right? So Governor Abbott definitely has to, logistics definitely has to play a big role in terms of how he governs, right? He has to be able to have constant communication with his people in terms, and what I mean by this, like people within his own office, crunching the numbers in terms of because when he proposes, when he's involved in the state budget proposing, the proposition process, he's got to have all those numbers handy, right? And that's why we'll talk about the legislative budget board later on, how it involves these high-ranking officials and how they are able to make those decisions. And of course, those decisions have to come from the numbers. How much money do we have? How many agencies are there in Texas? How much money are they going to need? All of this is important when it comes to the logistics of governability, because you have to be able to know how to properly administer these programs, with what you have. That's what logistics is. It's the resource that you have. Okay, so let's go with the providing power purposes of Constitution. Let's see. I think we might just, I think we'll finish here for today, and then we'll get to the constitutions next time here, because that's the second part of the chapter. And we're about 5 minutes, so I think this will finish out perfectly here. Okay, let me just get another last drink of water, and then we'll finish with this slide here for today. Okay, so providing power. All right, necessary and proper clause. Now, again, this is another reference back to federal government. The necessary and proper clause is an important clause within our Constitution here. It basically discusses, and this is mostly for Congress, but we can also use this in other aspects of our government, some of these other branches. But basically, the idea of the necessary and proper clause is, again, mostly dealing with Congress, but the idea can also be used in other places. Is that because it was written for Congress specifically. The idea is that Congress will pass laws that are necessary and proper to carry out their constitutional responsibility. So what I mean by this is, in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which basically discusses Congress's job description. It basically discusses what they're responsible for. They got to do this, and this, right? Just like any job description that you read when you're applying for a job or when you get hired for a job. So the idea here is that Congress has these responsibilities. Now, Article 1, Section 8 does not go into detail about how Congress goes about, carrying out these responsibilities. So Congress has a lot of leeway through the necessary and proper clause to come up, to pass laws dealing directly with those responsibilities. So the immigration aspect, right? The rule of naturalization that's listed within that, that their duties and responsibilities within Article 1, Section 8. It doesn't say how to do it. It just says this is what their responsibility is. Because then that leaves it up to Congress to go and get involved in the lawmaking process to then craft and create immigration law. So, and it's very important, right? Because if everything is just spelled out, then there's not going to be much deliberation. There's not going to be much debate, right? Because the Constitution is kind of doing the work for them, right? But the idea was to empower these members of Congress by giving them just the framework for what they need to do, and then you go about and do it, right? It's kind of a similar situation like with us as professors, right? We get a lot of what's called academic freedom, where we can decide how we're going to administer our class, how we're going to teach these, meet the core objectives. As long as we meet the core objectives, it's really up to us how we go about doing them, right? With a few, requirements such as the textbook that we use and things like that. But the extra resources I use, the way I craft my class when it comes to the grade weights, the quizzes, the exams, the number of those, how much they weigh, that's all on me. I'm the one who decides that, because I'm basically using my version of the necessary and proper clause, which is basically called academic freedom for professors. and I'm using that to craft my class to meet those core objectives. So, of course, other examples would be like the taxation responsibility. So Congress is tasked with with being responsible for taxes. Now, it doesn't say that how Congress does it, and that's also an example of delegating power to the executive branch. Where Congress has passed off some of these responsibilities, and tax is a great example of this, because when you're doing your federal income taxes every April, it's not Congress that's collecting it, right? Isn't it the IRS, right? An executive branch agency, right? So Congress has passed off the responsibility of actually collecting the taxes, actually counting the numbers, and actually ensuring that the tax money is that's coming in matches the numbers that you owe on taxes, because the IRS knows, right? You don't ever cheat the IRS, because they're going to find out, right? So whatever you have to pay it, right? And don't ever try to nickel and dime the IRS, because they'll definitely go after you. So, but it's not Congress that goes after you, right? It's the IRS that does it, right? So Congress has passed off that responsibility to the executive branch through the IRS. So that's also another power that Congress has, to be able to delegate that. Okay, I know it's already 3:45, so let me just finish up really quickly. Incorporation of the Bill of Rights, of course. Also keep in mind that this is kind of interesting, right? That when the Bill of Rights were originally passed as part of the ratification process of the Constitution, that's why when people talk about the number of amendments to the Constitution, technically we have 27. But if you don't count the Bill of Rights, the first 10, really the Constitution has only been amended 17 times in 250 years. But the idea behind the Bill of Rights, the incorporation of it, was that originally the Bill of Rights only pertained to the national government. So up until the conclusion of the Civil War, I'm getting ahead of myself, going into history part 2. Up until the conclusion of the Civil War, technically the Bill of Rights only applied to the national government. So this idea of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, unreasonable search and seizures, right, to an attorney, all this stuff, the states didn't have to do that. If the states wanted to go and restrict your freedom of speech, they could, because the Bill of Rights were only, they were only pertaining to the federal government. And of course, also keep in mind that the federal government was nowhere near the size of what it is today, right? Federal government was very, very small back in the 1800s because of dual federalism. So the states basically were pretty much the only de facto government that you interacted with on a daily basis. So that pretty much meant that the Bill of Rights were pretty much useless, because the states were the ones who were doing the heavy lifting of governing at the time. But after World War, I did it again. Sorry about that. Why am I thinking of World War II? I don't know, because I think I have to do stuff for my U.S. history of my 1302 class at UTRGV. Okay, again, Civil War, not World War II. I don't know why I'm thinking of World War II. The Civil War. After the Civil War ended, and we had the passage of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment. No, that's not equal rights. No, the not equal rights. I'm sorry. Like I told you, I've been out of it today. The equal rights. That's something else. No, the 14th Amendment. Due process, equal protection. That's what I meant to say. So with the incorporation of due process and equal protection within the 14th Amendment, this ascribed those Bill of Rights that originally only pertain to the national government. Now the states have to follow. Okay, so that's an example of how the states now have to adhere, to the federal Constitution here. And then, of course, limiting governmental power, legacy of colonial rule, and Texas' emphasis on limited power, right? So we're going to get into this next time here. We're going to talk about how that because of Texas being a rural state, from the very start, having people leave the United States from the American South, wanting to get away from government. A lot of these people that were coming over for Texas either had debts or they had issues with the government, particularly the federal government, and they wanted to kind of get away from that. They just wanted to kind of be left alone and do their own thing. So that's why when Santa Anna basically came to, consolidate power, that's why, they were not happy with it, right? Because they had left. They wanted to get away from too much of an overbearing government. Now they had to deal with it here in Texas. So this idea of colonial rule and handling things at the local level and not really having not wanting too much interaction with a strong central government also coincides with this idea of limited power, right? Because, local governments don't handle too many of those really high-ranking governmental things, right? They handle the everyday things, right? The things that people need to survive, right? And not really much of anything else. So all of this combines to limit government power as much as possible. In conservative states like Texas, government is looked at suspiciously, right? We don't want to just give the government power. We only want for them to do the bare minimum. We only want them to do what is absolutely necessary, and everything else either falls within the private sector or us personally, right? It's not the government's business to be interfering in our everyday affairs, and things like that, right? We don't want to give the government too much power, right? So I hope this makes sense in terms of limiting government power. Like I said, I kept messing up with some of these things, so sorry about that. Okay, anyway, so that pretty much sums up what I wanted for us to talk about today. We will discuss this more in detail when we talk about the constitutions next time here, everyone. So again, sorry that I kind of went a little bit over, but just wanted to ask you all if any of y'all have any questions for today. Is there anything that I can help you all with? Anything that you all need from me to address? Like I said, I'm going to change that due date here. Oh, hold on. Let me go ahead and stop the recording. Let's see. Okay. Okay.